What's up, y'all? Welcome back to From the Ground Up. Today, I want to go over what I believe are kind of the three main functional pillars when it comes to orthopedics and biomechanics of pelvic floor function. And this really stems from kind of what I consider to be my entire orthopedic biomechanical framework for the pelvic floor. So I'm going to give you what those three pillars are. I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into each pillar by itself, but then tie it kind of all back together. These three pillars are really the backbone or the entire framework of my whole philosophy when it comes to the biomechanics of the pelvis and the pelvic floor function. And this is really what I go super deep into in my full course. So if you haven't taken that one yet, make sure you're on the wait list because the next round is opening soon this spring. So the three things that I consider to be the main functional pillars of the pelvis and the pelvic floor is pelvic internal rotation, rib cage expansion and compression ability, and then midfoot load. And I really believe that if we get our patients to access and control all three of those functions in the body, we are going to see pelvic floor symptoms improve and really resolve. And the reason is because these three things are what allow the pelvic floor muscles to work in that automatic way that they're meant to work, to be responsive and react to load and pressure changes throughout the system. So pelvis internal rotation, rib cage compression and expansion ability, and midfoot load, or another way to say that is pronation. So let's start with the pelvis. Let's start with pelvis internal rotation. This is really what I consider a major missing piece of most of my pelvic floor clients, honestly. Everyone needs pelvis internal rotation, and most people either don't have the range for it or don't have the control of it. So what do I mean by pelvis internal rotation? There is an ilium component, so ilium internal rotation, and then there's also the femur component, or at the hip joint, hip internal rotation. And there's also this coupled way that they move together, but then they can also move opposite or relative to each other, right? So in a global sense, when I say we all need pelvis internal rotation for a functional pelvic floor, I'm talking about both. We need the ilium to be able to rotate internally, which is also kind of coupled as the ilium rotates internally. It also kind of has that posterior rotation. And then we also see that when that happens, when the iliums internally and posteriorly rotate, we also see that the pelvis outlet is going to widen. So when this happens, when we get internal rotation of the iliums, you can imagine that as they kind of turn inward and rotate posteriorly, those acetabulums of the ilium, they're actually going to kind of orient themselves a little bit more forward or anteriorly. You can kind of imagine those iliums rotating and then the acetabulums kind of turn and face a little bit more forward. So when that happens, that actually allows the femur now to access more internal rotation simply because we have moved kind of that anterior rim of the acetabulum out of the way. So thinking of the iliums, if they're more externally rotated, that acetabulum points more laterally, more kind of towards the backside. And then if we take the femoral head in that socket and try and go into some of that internal rotation at the hip, at the femur, it's going to bump up against that anterior front rim of the acetabulum a lot more quickly. So as soon as we take the iliums and rotate those internally, and they get a little bit of that posterior orientation, the pelvic outlet widens. As soon as we do that and those acetabulums kind of orient themselves to face more forward, suddenly now the femur itself, the femoral head, has a little more room to achieve that internal rotation range of motion. And so really the iliums are where we need to be thinking about improving this whole pelvis internal rotation. Because if the iliums can't achieve internal rotation, and if they're more externally rotated, the femurs also can't achieve that internal rotation. And getting this internal rotation at the ilium or at the pelvis itself, it really, really matters for pelvic floor function, because as soon as we gain that ilium IR, femoral IR, pelvic outlet is able to widen, that's when we can achieve this automatic and responsive pelvic floor ascension. Imagine like a little trampoline getting pulled more taut, it kind of like springs back upwards. That's what's happening when we get ilium internal rotation and that outlet widens. And femoral IR, then, when we achieve ilium IR and we allow or create more space for the femurs to go into more IR, that's when we're going to be able to get those nice glutes to lengthen, the deep hip rotators to lengthen eccentrically and kind of take load off of the pelvic floor. When the iliums remain more externally rotated, the femurs also have to remain more externally rotated. And that's when we get a lot of that compression at the back of the pelvis, the posterior pelvic floor. Everything kind of gets pushed and shoved forward. We get shortening of the posterior hip musculature. And then it just pushes that pressure forward. And we see things like bladder leaks, pressure symptoms, prolapse, things like that. So clinically, I kind of see two main presentations, if you will, of the pelvis positioning. So I'll either see more of an anteriorly oriented pelvis. So this is when both iliums kind of just dump forward, okay, go into more hip flexion. They're just kind of turned forward. What this does is this steals IR ability from the femur due to the ilium position on the femoral head, right? Because if we take the pelvis, we are holding the iliums, and we go into more flexion or anterior orientation rotation, right? That's actually more coupled with that externally rotated ilium, right? Because if you think back to what I explained a minute ago, ilium internal rotation is coupled with posterior rotation. So if we anteriorly rotate or orient the pelvis, that's coupled with external rotation, okay? So when our patients kind of live in that anterior pelvic tilt, we're actually stealing from the femur's ability to go into that internal rotation because it kind of already puts the ilium on top of it. So it really can't go farther into that because the acetabulum's right there, if that makes sense. So the second thing that I see clinically outside of the anterior orientation of the pelvis is my butt clenchers, right? So those are kind of the two main presentations. Now, my butt clenchers are the ones, these people have really flat glutes and kind of their pelvis as a whole is almost just like shoved forward from that clenching pressure, if you can picture that. So they kind of have this clenched butt, this flat butt. Maybe they always have a wedgie. Like I see these people walking around the grocery store, they have wedgies. And I'm just like, bro, we need some length back there. But they have their butt clenched. It kind of pushes or shifts their weight or their pelvis forward. And this is kind of going to shove the femoral head into ER and then shove it forward in the socket. Okay. So pelvis is being pushed forward. Glutes are clenching on the back, which is shoving that femoral head forward and kind of externally rotating it, right? So these people are actually more in femoral external rotation, but they're not utilizing the IR range of motion because everything's just so tight on the backside and holding those femurs there. So they still are not getting that nice internal rotation. And so the goal always, when it comes to the pelvis and when we're talking about biomechanics of the pelvis, the goal is always, always, always going to be restore the ability for the pelvis to go into internal rotation and for the femurs to go into internal rotation and then to be using that internal rotation. Like, yes, we need the range. We also need to use the range of motion. And when we can do this at the pelvis, when we can make sure the iliums can internally rotate and we can make sure the femurs can internally rotate, this is going to allow for better force absorption just in general as our patients like move around and work out, lift their kids, whatever they do. And it's going to improve pressure management because of the length we're going to be able to find in the pelvic floor muscles via that ilium IR outlet widening and kind of like opening of the outlet and stretch of the pelvic floor and ascension of the pelvic floor. That's going to allow better pressure management because it's going to allow that pelvic floor to push the guts back up and push the pressure back up. And we're going to see less leaking, less pressure, less heaviness, less prolapse, all because we have changed kind of the orientation and how the iliums move. We have achieved more ilium internal rotation ability, and we have utilize that internal rotation ability at the femur as well. We needed it both. Ilium and femur IR is critical to pelvic floor function, especially if we're trying to get it to function automatically like it should be. So the second pillar is this idea of ribcage compression and expansion and how it actually drives pelvis positioning. Okay, so we just talked all about pelvis positioning, pelvis rotation, where we need the pelvis to be for the pelvic floor muscles to function optimally. I'm here to tell you that position of the pelvis is largely driven by the rib cage and its ability to compress and expand into different areas. So there's kind of two common shapes that I think of when I think of rib cages. And of course, there's nuance here, but to try and just totally simplify it, I'm going to kind of give you these two most extreme shapes that I tend to see in my patients and then explain how they change the shape of the pelvis. So the first one is going to be our more like wide or flared rib cage patients. These patients tend to also have that anterior pelvic tilt posture that I just described in the pelvis section. Okay, so wide and a kind of a flared forward rib cage, and then their pelvis is also going to compensate. Is going to kind of dump forward right there. The second shape of the rib cage that I tend to see is going to be more of a narrow rib cage. And I picture these people, they're just kind of like locked down. So I call this like narrow and like locked down. And I'm just like, all that pressure is just like, it's just like being pushed down and out. These people are typically going to present with our clenched butts and that kind of that forward shift at the pelvis. Okay. So they kind of go hand in hand, and it's because what's happening at the rib cage is what drives the position of the pelvis. So we have a wide or a flared rib cage. That's usually going to drive the anterior pelvic tilt that we see in our patients. And then we have our narrow or like locked down rib cage, and that's usually going to present in our butt clenchers and kind of that forward shift of the pelvis. So the key idea here is that the position of the rib cage, which by the way, rib cage position is dictated by how it compresses and expands and rotates. Okay. So the position of the rib cage is what's going to dictate the pelvis's ability to achieve internal rotation. And that's because the position of the rib cage drives the position of the pelvis. Okay. A wider rib cage, so the wide rib cage, anterior flared rib cage, these pelvises are going to lack that internal rotation range of motion because of that anterior pelvic tilt. Because when the pelvis tilts anteriorly, the femur has nowhere else to go. It cannot further rotate. It's just going to butt up against that anterior acetabular rim. Okay. So wide rib cage, anterior pelvic tilt, pelvic or femur lacks more internal rotation range of motion because it can't. There's a kind of a bony block there, if you will. The narrow rib cage, okay, these are our narrow locked down people with the flat butt, forward shift pelvis, okay? These people have more IR potential at the pelvis, but they are not using it, right? These are the clenched butts. Their femurs are a little bit more externally rotated relative to the pelvis or the iliums, and they have this IR range of motion, but they're kind of just not using it because they're so clenched down in the butt. I just can't stop picturing the clenched butts. Okay. So what do those people need? The wider ribcage people, they actually need focus on gaining a full kind of exhale, which is going to allow their abdominal muscles to kick on and provide some kind of anterior compression from the TA, the external oblique, the internal oblique, right? So getting that full emptying exhale is what's really going to kick on those anterior abdominal wall muscles, which we need to kind of close down that flaring of both the pelvis and the rib cage, right? And then once we kind of have achieved that, we then use that tension that we've generated on the front side and we maintain it, and we try and help them direct their inhale or expansion capabilities more into kind of this front to back. So we're trying to kind of expand the rib cage to the back by maintaining some tension and compression on the front. So literally a great place to start with these people with wider rib cages and anterior pelvic tilts is working on long, sighing, full exhales getting that anterior abdominal wall compression going, holding that compression just via a long emptying exhale, and directing that expansion breath, that inhale breath, into the posterior aspect of the thoracic wall or the rib cage. That is a really good place to start with our wider rib cage people that have that kind of anterior pelvic tilt. Now, the narrow rib cage people, the more locked down rib cage people, these people, you can imagine, they are being more compressed from the side. So they already have a little bit more lateral compression, which is narrowing their rib cage. Okay. That means they're already a little bit wider front to back. So these people actually need lateral rib cage expansion more so. So these people, I'm going to focus more on, maybe I'm going to get them in side lying and I'm going to put an arm overhead and I'm going to direct a breath into the lateral rib cage. So focusing more on just breathing laterally and inhaling, creating that expansion laterally is going to be really, really helpful for these narrow people. These are the people that when we can reshape the rib cage and get a little bit more lateral expansion, created a little bit more of a wider rib cage angle, we're going to see a better orientation at the pelvis because of the changes it's going to kind of make at the sacrum. And that's going to allow them to unclench their butt, first of all, and then access the length that can come with that of the posterior pelvic floor, glute, deep hip rotator muscles, right? Because as soon as we can unclench those and get them to let go, now suddenly we can put them in some positions to lengthen those muscles and find kind of that eccentric internal rotation of the femur and pelvis, okay? So, just to recap that, the wide ribcage people tend to present with the anterior pelvic tilt. And so what we can focus on first, kind of helping these people get, is the wide ribcage people need a little bit more of that anterior abdominal wall compression first to then be able to direct the expansion, the inhale into the back, kind of this front to back ribcage expansion. That's going to change shape of the ribcage in a way that is going to help reorient the pelvis a little bit more neutral, get it more out of that anterior pelvic tilt, which is now going to allow more internal rotation at the femurs and at the iliums. Okay, that's the wider rib cage people. The narrow rib cage people, they're going to need more lateral rib cage expansion, and that's going to better orient their rib cage over their pelvis to help their butts unclench and to help them find length in the posterior pelvic floor and in the deep hip rotators and really lengthen into that femoral internal rotation. The goal here is not necessarily changing from one shape to the other. So we don't want our wider ribcage people to change into a narrow, and we don't want our narrow ribcage people to change into a wide. The goal is to create mobility and fluidity here at the rib cage. So we want to be able to move in and out of a wider rib cage and a more narrow rib cage angle, of an expanded rib cage and a compressed rib cage, right? And then when we throw rotation in the mix, rotation is simply compression on one side and expansion on the opposite side, right? And so we need those things. We need the rib cage to be able to change shape if we're going to get the pelvis to be able to change shape as well. Okay. Third pillar is midfoot loading, or another way that I phrase this is pronation, okay? This is something I kind of call like the IR cascade or the pronation cascade, okay? From the ground up, when the midfoot can go into this pronation, into this loaded position, particularly in, mid stance phase, whether it's walking, running, jumping, landing, cutting, going from sit to stand, squatting, whatever it is, when we load into that midfoot, okay, and we get that pronation, that is going to set off a cascade above it. That is going to require dorsiflexion. It's going to require the tibia to go into IR. It's going to require the femur to go into IR, and it's going to require the ilium to achieve some IR, okay? So it's a beautiful cascade. We love when that happens. We love when we achieve kind of this full body IR from the ground up. But the problem is, if the foot can't pronate, we never get it, okay? If our patients cannot load into their midfoot, then that cascade doesn't happen and they cannot achieve IR at the pelvis, which is our first pillar for a functional pelvic floor, is we have to be able to achieve IR at the pelvis, okay? So if the midfoot can't load, We probably can't achieve IR at the pelvis either. And this means that we're not going to be able to achieve a pelvic floor that can automatically and responsively get that kind of functional ascension for support and pressure management. And this is true even if we address the rib cage and the pelvis, y'all. So, like, we could have done such good work at the rib cage and created expansion here and compression there. And we're doing some drills to change the shape of the iliums, and we're bringing adductors on board, or we're bringing external rotators on board, or like whatever the case may be to change those shapes. But if the problem is stemming from the ground up, they're going to get off the floor or they're going to get off your table and they're going to walk out of your clinic, and nothing is going to have changed because you didn't address this limitation kind of downstream or from the ground up. And it's just such a common thing that people will miss because they're so hyper focused on the pelvis or on the abdominals or on how we breathe. And like all of that is so huge. Those are two of the pillars. But we can't forget the third pillar, the literal leg that we stand on. We have to be treating the pelvic floor from the ground up, y'all. The pelvic floor, it's going to need your foot to be able to go into and out of that pronation, okay? The reason I harp so much on pronation is most patients have supination, they lack the pronation because most of us lack IR in general, and pronation is just IR of the midfoot. So our foot needs pronation range of motion, full stop. First of all, we got to have the range. But when and if we have the range, we also need the control of that range. This is the same for any other joint of the body. We need functional range of motion, and then we need control of that range of motion so it doesn't get out of control, right? Same with the midfoot. We need to be able to pronate, you guys. It is not a bad thing to see foot pronation. Where it becomes problematic is when we can't spring back out of it or we can't control it. So we see this like collapse into it, right? And so if our patients are never finding that pronation, they're never getting that IR at the pelvis, and those pelvic floor muscles, they can't do their job. And so that could be a huge like missing link essentially if you do everything else right and you just miss this. So make sure you're looking at all of it. Look at the pelvis, look at the rib cage, look at it from the top down, and look at the foot so you're treating it from the ground up as well. Because truly, we need this whole body system for the pelvic floor to function the way it was designed to function. For us to get this pelvis internal rotation, which is what's going to allow that automatic responsive function of the pelvic floor muscles, is that internal rotation of the pelvis, right? We have to have a rib cage that can compress and expand correctly in the direction that it needs to do it and be mobile and be able to get in and out of those shapes, right? And we need a midfoot that can load itself into its full range of motion in a controlled manner. All of those things combined, I'm telling you, if you focus on those three pillars with your patients, you are going to create pelvic floors that work automatically. And this is why I'm like, why are we cueing patients when to squeeze their pelvic floor? Like, oh, squeeze your pelvic floor when you lift heavy or when you stand up from the squat or, when you go down to pick up your kid off the floor or whatever. It's like, if we would just ensure that they have these three pillars, that they have the ability to achieve internal rotation of the pelvis, that they have the ability to change shape of the rib cage, and that they have the ability to load the midfoot, they don't have to think about their pelvic floor, y'all. Like, it will do its job. This is my entire message for the whole world. Like, fix the system in all aspects, the pelvic floor function will follow, and it will be automatic and responsive and all of those yummy things that we know that it should be doing. This is quite literally my entire framework of my course. Like, every single module goes deep into one of these pillars. And then there's also, each one of these three pillars is one module in and of itself. And then there's also two other modules on the front and on the back end that give you more patient communication. So how to actually run your eval, what are the objective tests that no one's ever taught you that I'm about to teach you. And then kind of the final module is more holistic considerations, like how are we thinking outside of the box, if you will, not only orthopedically or biomechanically, what are some other factors that are at play that are likely contributing to their symptoms. So this is my entire framework, and I just summed it up in a 25-minute podcast. So hopefully that's helpful. If you found it helpful, I would love it if you would send this episode to another pelvic floor therapist so that way they could kind of start thinking this way. I love it when you guys share this to your stories and tag me. It just makes my day because I'm like, oh, great. I'm glad that they found this helpful. So share it to your stories, tag me, Tell me what you found the most helpful. Tell me when you try these things with your patients, how it goes, all of the things. And make sure, you guys, that if you have not taken my signature course, my No Kegels course, that you get on the dang wait list, because the next round is this spring and I only open this twice a year. So be on the wait list. Make sure that you are looking at the whole system. If you truly want to restore automatic functioning of the pelvic floor muscles, send this episode to a friend. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And let's change the game, y'all.